Hello and welcome to the House of Dissent. In this episode, I want to discuss democratic socialism, mainly because of the resurgence and publicity democratic socialists are experiencing in the USA today. The Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, was founded in 1982, but has its roots in two other, now defunct groupings dating back to 1971. It's a young movement compared to British democratic socialism, but nevertheless, within a relatively short period of time, the DSA has scored some notable successes. For instance, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, otherwise known as AOC, is in the House of Representatives, and Zoran Mamdani became the mayor of New York in January 2026. Although not directly aligned to the DSA, more recently Abdul El-Sayed won the Michigan Senate primary for the Democrats in August 2026 against the mainstream Democrat candidate, Haley Stevens. In an article published by The Guardian titled Abdul El-Sayed wins Michigan Senate primary in defining race for Democrats on Wednesday 5th of August this year, the paper reported, and I quote, more than $40 million poured into the race from outside groups supporting Stevens or attacking El-Sayed, including from groups associated with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, a pro-Israel lobby. Some ads elevated Stevens' connection to Barack Obama on the auto rescue, which voters have seen as a quasi-endorsement, despite Obama not formally endorsing in the race. The fact that the Democrat establishment supported Stevens but nevertheless lost is seismic in U.S. politics. But El-Sayed's victory isn't a victory for democratic socialism because he doesn't align with the DSA. That said, the fact that El-Sayed is more than happy to work alongside democratic socialists signals a seismic shift in American politics. Because, after all, this is a country where liberals are viewed by many Americans as leftists. And don't even mention Marxism. Shh, I didn't say that. Of course, the ideals of democratic socialism have been operating in plain sight via Bernie Sanders, the independent senator for Vermont. Sanders has, however, been a one-man band, seen to be a lone voice on the periphery of American mainstream politics, and a bit harmless. That changed when AOC entered the House of Representatives, but the real shift went into overdrive when Mamdani, a democratic socialist, began running and won the mayoral race in New York. Suddenly, the mainstream media and mainstream politicians were focusing on the idea of democratic socialism, even if, in general, they remain clueless about what it means. I can't help but wonder what the Caribbean Marxist writer C.L.R. James would be thinking if he were alive today. After all, in his book, A Rendezvous with History, he promised to return from the dead if the workers in the USA sought to remove capitalism in favour of socialism. Unlike many Marxists, C.L.R. James remained optimistic about the possibility of change in the US, despite it being at the high altar of capitalism. And this was in part because of the inherent contradictions within the US, who C.L.R. James said was not immune from dialectical change, which is, after all, the driving force of historical materialism. On that note, both Schopenhauer and Horkheimer claimed that human suffering, poverty, etc. could force people to take action and possibly lead to emancipation. Horkheimer's thinking on suffering was, however, different from Schopenhauer's because he advocated for a socialist political party to advance the interests of the people, whereas Schopenhauer argued that enlightenment would raise the individual above the hopelessness of suffering within the present system. In a sense, grasping the realities of life, suffering, etc., has eclipsed the false ideology of the American dream, and at least for some right now, democratic socialism offers a way forward. Even the smallest seeds grow into mighty trees. Democratic socialism has its formal roots in early 19th century Britain, when the Chartists campaigned for democratic rights. This was in 1838, but the embryonic or evolutionary elements that will lead to democratic socialism go even further back in time. For instance, in the middle period of the 17th century in England, there were the Diggers and Levellers, as well as a whole host of dissenting groups, far too numerous to mention here. The Diggers called themselves the True Levellers, and dismissed the Levellers as moderate reformists. The Diggers were agrarian communists in England, and they sought to destroy private property and return life to its true communal self, as they saw it. They deeply believed that all land should be held in common, and not be divided by anyone, especially the rich and powerful, or to quote the 19th century English poet Percy Shelley, for the many and not the few. The Diggers were Protestant dissenters and believed in economic equality where communes would share the means of production for the common good. The Diggers looked to the Act of the Apostles for their theological inspiration, because the Acts deals with an important question for Christians, namely, should Christians obey God or the Roman Empire? Now, for the Diggers, this translated into the following question: should Christians obey God and the preservation of communal land, or those that falsely divide land into private property? This was a struggle over the earthly goods and materialism. The architect of the Diggers was Gerald Winstanley, whom I greatly admire. And here's my favourite quote from Winstanley, written in the New Law of Righteousness, published in 1649. And I quote, "The rich man tells the poor that they offend reason's law, if they take from the rich. I am sure it is a breach in that law, in the rich to have plenty by them, and yet will see their fellow creatures, men and women, to starve for want. Reason requires that every man should live upon the increase of the earth, though covetousness fights against reason's law." Now, the Diggers opposed the private ownership of land, or what would become known as enclosures, where common land was divided up, initially by William the Conqueror after the 1066 Battle of Hastings. The Diggers would occupy private land, and we can see a strong connection between the Diggers' approach and the writings of Karl Marx with respect to private property. Winstanley was influenced by the Peasants' Revolt, led by the radical Wat Tyler in 1381, who sought social and economic reforms by removing serfdom. The peasant rebels also insisted on forcing the church to give up their land and give back wealth to the people, and they also sought laws for defending free trade for the people, because at the time monopolies controlled trade to their economic advantage. Now here's the thing. Given that Abdul El-Sayed has criticized the oligopoly that exists in the USA today, and that he wants a reformed capitalism, perhaps he should study the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Because that is exactly what they were attempting to achieve. There's also the Peterloo Massacre to discuss in relation to social reform. And here's an extract taken from the excellent People's History Museum in Manchester, which I visited 2 years ago. And I quote, "In the context of poverty and the huge numbers of working people pushed into the industrial centres in and around Manchester, a reform movement demanding the right to representation captured the minds of large numbers of ordinary people. Despite the growing population of Manchester, there was no MP to solely represent the area. A demonstration was called in Manchester, which, by being postponed to Monday 16th of August 1819, meant people were readily prepared for it. A Monday seems a strange date to choose, yet for the handloom weavers, who were still the majority in the cotton trade in the area, after working all weekend, they traditionally took Mondays off. These workers, who feared for their jobs and standard of living, made up a large component of the protesters. Now, the Peterloo Memorial Campaign says, and I quote, "An estimated 18 people, including 4 women and a child, died from sabre cuts and trampling. Nearly 700 men, women and children received extremely serious injuries, all in the name of liberty and freedom from poverty." What's of interest to American citizens is that the reform movement was inspired by the French Revolution, and in particular the writings of the Englishman Thomas Paine in The Rights of Man, published in 1791. Thomas Paine would be hugely influential in convincing the American colonists to rebel against the British in his 1776 pamphlet called Common Sense. Quickly after the Peterloo Massacre came the Tolpuddle Martyrs, who were agricultural workers from Tolpuddle village in Dorset, England, who struggled for better wages and working conditions. In 1834, they were arrested and exiled to Australia and Van Diemen's Land with the original punishment of 7 years in exile. This was reduced to 2 and 3 years due to public protests, and all for their belief in a more egalitarian society. The Tolpuddle Museum is one of my favourite places to visit, and each year in July there's a festival to commemorate the martyrs and keep alive what they endured back in 1834 and what they stood for. Their leader, George Lovelace, wrote eloquently about their struggle in his pamphlet The Victims of Whiggery, published in 1837. George Lovelace asked an important question in the face of the brutality of the political and mainstream Anglican religious establishment in relation to the poor working and living conditions labourers, agriculture workers and so forth and their families had to endure, along with the low wages they received for their hard labour in the fields. So, George Lovelace asked, and I quote, "What, then, is to be done, given their wretched conditions?" It was a call to take action against the oppressive system in England at the time. 65 years later, Lenin asked an almost identical question when he published his pamphlet called What is to be Done? The only word missing was then. Was Lenin aware of George Lovelace's pamphlet? We'll never know, but what both had in common was a willingness to confront their respective oppressive establishments. George Lovelace was a primitive Methodist and preacher who, with 5 other labourers, formed the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers, an agricultural trade union, in 1833. They met in secret and swore an oath of allegiance to their aims, because it was so dangerous for them if they were discovered to have organised a trade union, and it was for these reasons that there were no formal documents or written proposals on what type of demands they were seeking. Thus, it's entirely understandable that democratic socialism begins formally with the Chartist movement only 4 years later, because they produced a written People's Charter in 1838, which contained 6 demands. And these demands were as follows. 1. Universal male suffrage and voting rights for every man aged 21 and older. 2. A secret ballot. 3. No property qualifications. 4. Salaries for members of Parliament. 5. Equal constituencies of same size for fairness. And 6. Elections held every year to keep politicians accountable. Now, I'm proud to say that one of the strongholds of Chartism was in my city of birth, Newport in South Wales, where the Chartists staged the Newport Rising on November 4th, 1839, where Chartist supporters came from all over the Gwent region to march upon the Westgate Hotel in Newport. Each year on November 4th, people of Newport and the wider area recreate the Chartist walk to the Westgate Hotel to commemorate the deaths of 22 Chartists shot dead by soldiers from the 45th Regiment of Foot, who were from Nottinghamshire, some 150 miles away. The three leaders were John Frost, Zephaniah Williams and William Jones, who were tried and found guilty of high treason, and each was sentenced to death by being hung, drawn, and quartered. This was a brutal and barbaric form of capital punishment that makes ISIS look like moderates, but the sentence reflects the establishment's fear of the emerging ideals of democratic socialism. To be hung, drawn, and quartered meant, firstly, the person is drawn where they are tied to a wooden frame called a hurdle, then dragged behind a horse to the execution site. Then they are hanged from the gallows, but cut down while still alive and conscious. They were then emasculated and disemboweled while still alive. Their organs and entrails were removed and burnt in front of them. Then they were beheaded and quartered, where the head was chopped off and the body divided into 4 parts. And if that wasn't enough, the severed head and body parts were then put on public display to deter others from taking similar actions. The sentence for the three, however, was commuted, and their punishment was exactly the same as George Loveless, and they were transported, but for life, to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, Australia, in June 1840. There's a small memorial to the Chartist uprising in Rogerstone, just outside Newport in South Wales, which is worth a visit. The Chartists may have failed in their endeavours, but in 1884 the Fabian Society was founded, with its leading figure Frank Podmore arguing against revolution and preferring a slow but determined form of social, economic and political reform. Indeed, the Fabian Society's logo was a tortoise, depicting its slow movement towards democratic socialism. Its coat of arms was a sheep in wolf's clothing, the idiom taken from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, warning about deceptive practices. Podmore, however, used this symbol as a positive form of action. Podmore, along with Sidney Webb, conducted research into social reform, which included a study of utopian socialism, particularly that advocated by Robert Peel, and their findings reveal a criticism of utopian socialism, particularly its emphasis on finding the ideal structure of society. The Fabian Society, then, were instrumental to the formation of democratic socialism. However, in the 1970s, it takes a significant left turn when Tony Benn rejected the mixed economy model for a more radical economic system. In an article for the Tribune online magazine titled Tony Benn's Lessons for the Left, written by the Labour MP Richard Bergen, the author says, and I quote, "His ideas on the economy began to radicalise in the aftermath of Labour's 1970 general election defeat, as the limitations of the post-war mixed economy started to be felt. Benn's alternative was based on a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families, as Tony Benn said. Now, Tony Benn was instrumental in creating the Alternative Economic Strategy, otherwise known as the AES, which Richard Bergen says was, and I quote, a socialist response to the economic crisis of the 1970s. The AES set out plans to expand public control of the economy by purchasing 25 of the biggest manufacturing companies from various sections of the economy. It included public ownership of major financial institutions to give democratic control over the investment policies of pension funds and other sources of industrial finance. Tony Benn was a Democratic and Christian socialist who, in 1981, came close to defeating the right-winger Dennis Healey in the election for deputy leader. Benn lost by 1% of the vote in a bitter and fractious contest, and if he had won, democratic socialism would have gained huge momentum within the Labour Party. In Tony Benn's book, titled Arguments for Socialism, he says this, and I quote, "Democratic socialism, this is very much a homegrown British product which has been slowly fashioned over the centuries. The Labour Party comprises within its ranks representatives of a wide range of opinions. We have been wise enough not to seek to impose a common socialist dogma on anyone. Indeed, our socialism grew out of experience and was not handed down from above or received from outside. The British Labour movement was born out of the chapels of dissenters and the struggles of factory workers who campaigned for trade union rights, then for the parliamentary vote, then organised themselves to nominate candidates in a separate Labour Party, and finally adopted an explicitly socialist approach, based on a full commitment to a democratic system and personal freedom." Now, the details that I have included in this podcast show that deep history in British democratic socialism, and it's refreshing that in the US, this historical tradition is finally breaking through into the area of politics historically controlled by the mainstream. This is healthy dissent. Here's another quote from Tony Benn, and I quote, "The Labour Party has worked on the basis that the investment gap must be filled by public investment, with proper public accountability and public ownership, and that only public expenditure can convert human needs into economic demands, able to command resources and help restore full employment. Indeed, we believe that the nation can earn its living efficiently and profitably only if there is a new balance of wealth and power in favour of working people, and to avoid corporatism creeping in as a byproduct of these public initiatives, we have been working for a wider and deeper accountability of power through greater democratic control by Parliament and of finance and industry and of the institutions of the Labour Party itself. The next decade will see a growth of democratic socialism against the ideas of monetarism and corporatism." However, since Benn's writings, democratic socialism has declined in the UK, and this was accelerated with the removal of the original Clause 4 in the Labour Party's constitution, written in 1917 by Beatrice and Sidney Webb. And Clause 4 said this: "To secure for the workers, by hand or by brain, the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry or service." That removal of Clause 4 meant that the Labour Party took a new turn into the right. And currently they were called New Labour under Tony Blair. And Tony Blair's gift, I'm sorry to say, to the Labour Party was an update of Clause 4. which partly says the Labour Party is a democratic socialist party. But I'm not going to read the rest because it's just waffle. Incredibly, in September 2015, a student of Ben, Jeremy Corbyn, became leader of the Labour Party, putting democratic socialism centre stage. And thus began the vile media and political campaigns to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. A part of this vile campaign was by many elected Labour MPs who were either the centre or on the right of the party, and who were Blairites. They even campaigned to help the Tories defeat Labour, such is their hatred of the left. Jeremy Corbyn became the most demonised leader of any British party in history, and now sits as an independent, because the right of the party, under the failed Keir Starmer government, forced Corbyn out of the party he had belonged to for 55 years. Considering what I discussed thus far, it is clear that there are so many lessons democratic socialists can learn from this deep British history, including the media and political campaigns to discredit them, which has already begun in earnest and will increase immeasurably if El-Sayed gets elected into the Senate. I think the response in the US is going to make the faked Zinoviev letter scandal in the 1920s Britain look like a birthday party. Grigory Zinoviev was a Bolshevik and head of the Soviet Comintern and was extremely close to Lenin, thus a leading figure in Russian politics. The Daily Mail published the so-called Zinoviev letter 4 days before the general election in the UK in 1924, claiming that the Bolsheviks were behind an imminent revolution in Britain to be led by British communists. The letter was a fake, and this was Britain's own Red Scare, and it helped defeat the Labour government. Such was the fear of socialism by the conservative and liberal press, and all of the political establishment. The latest Red Scare started November 5th, 2025 in the US, when one of Rupert Murdoch's propaganda rags, which is called the New York Post, produced its anti-Mamdani headline, The Red Apple, after Mamdani's victory becoming the Democratic Socialist Mayor of New York. Included on the front page was, and I quote, "On your marks, get set, Zo, Socialist Mamdani wins race for mayor." Now, Marx, not spelt M-A-R-K-S, but rather M-A-R-X, as in Karl Marx, a simple play on words written by simpletons. Mamdani is a democratic socialist, not a Marxist. The New York Post also claimed that Mamdani hated Israel, which is patently a lie. Still, lies and the Murdoch press go hand in hand because the same tactics were used by another of Murdoch's rags in the UK, the Sun newspaper, when it led the press fight against the Democratic Socialist, late leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, beginning in 2015. The Sun newspaper also led a vicious attack on the previous Labour Party leader, Ed Miliband, who they labelled Red Ed, because he is the son of the Marxist writer Ralph Miliband. Like Mamdani, Ed Miliband is no Marxist, and he's the current Foreign Secretary of the Labour government, who recently met with the ultra-conservative Marco Rubio. Make of that what you will, but no doubt Rubio would have been fully briefed about Ed Miliband. The New York Post Red Scare campaign took a political turn in the week leading up to July 26, 2026, when the US State Department published its document titled Cuba, the Capital of 21st Century Communism, which I discussed in the episode on Cuba. There is no doubt in my mind that Cuba is not the only target of what is a propaganda document, but rather to link Cuba to the rise of democratic socialism in the USA today. On the Common Dreams website, it ran a piece on August 5th, 2026, titled Mamdani responds to Mike Johnson's fear-mongering over Marxist Democrats and mini Mamdanis after El-Sayed win. A day later, on August 6, 2026, Time magazine ran a piece titled Trump labels Abdul El-Sayed a hateful communist. Now, El-Sayed is a progressive Democrat who rejects the label of socialist and presumably therefore rejects democratic socialism in its entirety. People often confuse the two, but they are substantially different ideological positions. But here's the interesting thing about democratic socialism, because it is a means to achieving socialism. And here there are some interesting similarities with what is happening in China, Vietnam, and possibly Cuba, although it's too early to tell about Cuba. But all the indications are the Cubans would like to follow the Chinese and Vietnamese models by embracing capitalist production as a means to achieve socialism. However, the critical difference is that the American democratic socialists do not advocate for a one-party state and would maintain a multi-party system. Now, El-Sayed is not aligned to democratic socialism, so what is he then? Well, the answer to that question can be found in an interview El-Sayed gave to CBS News titled Abdul El-Sayed on Socialist Labels, Who He Thinks Belongs in the Democratic Party, which you can find on YouTube. In the video, he tells the host that he wants to build, and I quote, a broad coalition with a range of different interests from members of the DSA to existing Trump voters. In the interview, he also said this, and I quote, folks who come here, like with 2 weeks left in the election, really want to label me a socialist. I don't know why, except for maybe it fits into a nice telling of a broader national story. But I'm a scientist, right? And I like solutions that solve problems. I don't do ideology. I'd rather think of myself as a capitalist who actually read about capitalism, in the sense that the biggest risk to capitalism was always going to be the corporate consolidation and monopoly rather than government regulation. Now, for me, El-Sayed comes over as both naive and a bit of a dreamer. And what he refers to as a broad coalition is what is historically called a popular front. And history sadly tells us that popular fronts fail due to the vast ideological differences within them, despite him not doing ideology. One example is the 100 Days government in Cuba, led by Ramon Grau. It was a popular front which included revolutionary socialists and fascists. It failed. The Popular Front movements in both Spain and France in 1930s both failed. In 2024, the new Popular Front was launched in France, but this Popular Front is an alliance of leftist parties, excluding liberal, conservative and neo-fascist parties. Will that last? Only time will tell. But let's be honest, left-wing groupings are very good at factionalizing. In a Guardian article titled, He's a Doctor and a Progressive, Will He Win a Key U.S. Senate Race in Michigan, published July 26, 2026, El-Sayed said this, and I quote, if the markets actually work the way they're supposed to, you might have some different movement of money. The problem is, we don't live in capitalism, we live in oligopoly. Now, of course, once again, his reference in opposition to oligopoly is, as I mentioned earlier, exactly what the Peasants' Revolt in 1381 was partly about. Time to research Wat Taylor, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt, dear Abdul. And whilst I'm at it, my other suggestion to El-Sayed, given he said he's read about capitalism, is to read Marx's 3 volumes of Das Kapital, if he hasn't already done so. In Article 2, Title Purpose of the DSA's Constitution, it says, in part, we are socialists because we reject an economic order based on private profit, alienated labour, gross inequalities of wealth and power. We are socialists because we share a vision of a humane social order based on popular control of resources and production, economic planning, equitable distribution. We are socialists because we are developing a concrete strategy for achieving that vision, for building a majority movement that will make democratic socialism a reality in America. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.